The largest and hottest library of 16-bit games plays on Sega Genesis. Streets of Rage, only on the 16-bit Genesis system from Sega.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Ultimate Sega Genesis review here on Player One Start. Where we last left off, we were looking at the first games to come out for the Sega Genesis, and I said in the next video that we'd start looking at games in a more broad sense across its entire lifetime. But before we get too far into it, don't forget to hit that like button, and if this is your first time here, please remember to hit that subscribe button and the bell icon to be notified when I make future posts. Getting right down to it, there were games published for the Sega Genesis consistently between 1989 and 1997-98. In that time frame, there were several games released for the Sega Genesis because Sega really wanted to build up an instant library of third-party titles that they were not able to do with the Sega Master System. This resulted in a massive game library that is going to take a while to get through, and we're going to try to do this by genre to kind of limit it to one type of game at a time. In this video, I'm going to focus on the action, platform, and beat-em-up style games. And as there are a lot, I'm going to showcase a few of them right off the bat and then dive a little bit deeper into some of the most popular and my personal favorites. wow, I mean, that montage was a lot of iconic games, and even for an Ultimate Genesis review, we are not going to have enough time to cover all of them in as much detail as they deserve. However, I am going to handpick a few titles that I am most familiar with, and some of the most iconic games I feel are on this platform. Let's go ahead and dive into a few of them. Oh my gosh, talk about a nostalgia overload. So that opening sequence there is probably one of the most iconic pieces of video game history ever to exist. Imagine for a moment that you're a gamer growing up in the 1980s, and most of the games you have played have been on the Nintendo Entertainment System and the Atari 2600. Then you pop this game into your newly acquired Sega Genesis, and this is what you see. Between the music, advanced graphics, and core gameplay, nothing released prior to this game even came close. And although this game established Sonic and Sega as key players in the new era of 16-bit gaming, this game is not without its flaws. The first act of this game is almost near masterpiece quality, and it doesn't really seem to match the rest of the game in terms of its core gameplay style and art direction. And for me personally, there's one crucial gameplay element that is missing from the first game that ranks it below its sequel, Sonic 2. And that is the spin dash. In this game, there are several areas where you'll find yourself stuck in an area and you have to move back and forth to build up momentum before you can get out of it. However, in Sonic 2, all you have to do is crouch and mash the action button on your controller as fast as you can to build up momentum, and then you just let go to launch yourself into the next area. Again, Sonic 1 is not necessarily a bad game, but I do prefer its sequel much more than playing the original. Sonic 3 and Sonic & Knuckles were released at the height of both Sega and Sonic's popularity, and Sonic 3D Blast was released towards the end of the console's lifecycle. I am skimming over these games just a little bit because I've already covered each of these games in their own videos, which you can see linked in the description or at the end of this video. Also cited as some of the fan favorites from this system are a lot of the Disney interactive games that were released on this platform. The practice of movie studios licensing out their characters and movie concepts to make video games was nothing new. This happened all the way back on the Atari 2600, with varying degrees of success. However, it wasn't until the Nintendo Entertainment System when these games started gaining a lot more notoriety amongst gamers. And in contrast to other movie studios that licensed out their properties to different developers and really didn't have much to do with the games, Disney was more heavily involved in the making of their games, sometimes even being directly responsible for their development. And when it comes to anything that bears Mickey Mouse's likeness, Disney is very controlling. That is perhaps one of the many reasons why Castle of Illusion starring Mickey Mouse was one of the best video games based on this character. This was one of the first times that Disney artists were actually responsible for the animations of their characters in the game. This is partially because the 8-bit systems were not really capable of producing animation and graphics that were very similar to how the cartoons looked outside of video games. In terms of story, this game has a very simplistic plot that was very common in a lot of platformers, in which Mickey must rescue his girlfriend Minnie from the Castle of Illusion and the witch named Mizrabel, who wants to steal Minnie's youth. Mickey is told that in order to defeat Mizrabel, he must find the 7 gems of the rainbow. These gems are acquired by defeating bosses at the end of levels. In terms of gameplay controls, Mickey's main method of attack is to perform a bounce while jumping, which can be used to defeat enemies, or to bounce upwards towards higher areas. Mickey can also collect projectiles such as apples and marbles to throw at his opponents. There are also various items in the levels that can earn bonus points, increase the player's health, and grant extra lives. As previously mentioned, each stage ends with a boss fight. However, in easy mode, you only play through the first 3 levels with no boss fights, and you can beat the game that way, which I can assume was done to appeal to younger kids. Personally, although this is not a game I grew up with, I actually did enjoy this game quite a bit, especially for it being a kid-style game. It does remind me of some of those earlier titles that were basically Mario clones, but it has its own style and charm that I found quite entertaining. However, I ended up liking its sequel just as well, if not better. Quackshot, starring Donald Duck, and Huey, Dewey, and Louie, they take the game series in a different direction by turning it into a platform shooting game. In this game, the player, as Donald Duck, goes through a variety of side-scrolling levels. Generally, each level is divided into an overland part and a dungeon part. Although the player may choose any order to play the overland sections, various obstacles prevent the player from entering the dungeons outside of a specific order. In addition to this, some levels provide the player with vital clues, which can solve puzzles needed to progress in later sections. Once Donald has completed the overland section of an area, he may leave by calling his nephew's biplane, and will return to the dungeon entrance of that area if he chooses to return. The gameplay is switched up a little bit by arming Donald with a special gun that can shoot plungers, popcorn, or bubblegum. The player has unlimited plungers, which can temporarily stun enemies, and collect other ammo along the way. Later in the game, the plunger is upgraded to act as a temporary platform to climb walls, and, when stuck to a passing bird, it allows Donald to traverse longer distances. In Duckburg, India, and Egypt, Donald can also pick up chili peppers, which increase his temper, eventually temporarily allowing him to become invincible, increase his speed, and knock down enemies in his path. This game has been frequently cited in top games lists for the platform, and although some may find this game a little bit too easy, it is definitely worth a pickup if you can find it. And I would put some of the Disney movie-based games, such as Aladdin and The Lion King, in a class of their own. These games are iconic and should appeal to a wide variety of gamers. And again, since I've already covered both of these games in their own review videos, I'm just going to summarize by saying that these are two of the best platformers on the system that should provide a memorable experience. Playmates Toys, finding success with their license for Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, wanted to start their own franchise, free of licensing fees. Inspired by the success of Sonic the Hedgehog, they decided that they wanted to start the franchise as a video game, a rare approach at that time. From there, the game's design started with a simple sketch of an earthworm that was presented to Shiny Entertainment. Impressed with the artwork, Shiny Entertainment bought the rights to Earthworm Jim and started developing the game. The game's crazy atmosphere, world, and characters was partially due to the fact that the company had always previously been restricted to doing licensing games like 7-Up's Cool Spot, where they had to conform to the company's preset limitations. In that way, the game was actually created as a satire of platform video games at that time. For example, Princess What's-Her-Name was actually a parody of how many video games had throwaway female characters that needed to be saved. The Sega Genesis was the first platform to get Earthworm Jim. It was then that players were first able to take control of Earthworm Jim in his 2D side-scrolling platformer environment with elements of running and gunning. The player must safely get Earthworm Jim to the end of each level while avoiding enemies or defeating them with the gun or his head whip for whipping enemies. There are some levels, however, such as For Pete's Sake, that involves making sure that a puppy gets to the end of the level unharmed. The game has also been noted for its fluid animation, featuring a hand-drawn style that was unusual for 16-bit releases, especially for environments and characters that were built from the ground up to be on video game platforms. Earthworm Jim did receive a sequel on the Sega Genesis that was received as well, if not better, than its original, but in terms of my personal preference, I actually recommend the sequel slightly above the original, just because I feel like they were able to hammer out a few of the gameplay details better, and I feel the soundtrack is much better than the first game. I almost don't know where to even start with this game. From the visually appealing graphics, to the stellar soundtrack that really just knocks it out of the park, and to the core gameplay that is true to the series formula that one would expect from a Castlevania game, I have to say that this game is one of my personal favorites on the system. And up until 2019, this was the only way you could play the game, as it was released on the Castlevania Collection and on the Sega Genesis Mini, both in the same year. I would say to someone who has never played a Castlevania game before, this would be a good game to start with, as it pretty much takes the best of each of the previous games and combines it into one experience. In this game, players must proceed through each level, defeating enemies and collecting gems to power special weapons. Each stage is divided into sections that has a minor boss in the middle with a main boss at the end. Some items will increase the power of the character's weapons, and certain parts of the game are split up into different paths that can only be traversed based on which character you chose. Again, this game is touted on several best games lists for this console. However, some feel that this game has been overlooked due to the fact that it was only released on this platform for so long. Vectorman is yet another game that I've covered in its own review video, but I wanted to reiterate it here as its importance to this console should not be overlooked. This game was Sega's answer to Donkey Kong Country, and the fact that it uses pre-rendered sprites and backgrounds to display much better graphics than the system itself was capable of generating. While the game uses a different art style approach and gameplay style than Donkey Kong Country, I feel that it's a good game in its own right, and is definitely one of my personal favorites on this system. Ecco The Dolphin is an action-adventure game originally developed by Novotrade International for the Sega Genesis and published by Sega in 1992. In this game, you play as the title character Ecco, a bottlenose dolphin, who travels through time to combat hostile extraterrestrials in Earth's oceans and on an alien spacecraft. To attack enemies, you must start swimming rapidly by hammering down on the swim button and holding it down to maintain speed until you slam into an enemy. Two features of the gameplay based on actual dolphin habits is one that allows Ecco to sing, which lets Ecco communicate with other sea creatures, and the same button is also used for echolocation. Holding it down causes the song to return, generating a map of the area. Several levels contain enormous crystals or glyphs, which respond in different ways if Ecco touches them or sings to them. Some block paths, and a key glyph must be found in such cases to pass. while others just give information, and a few in the later levels replenish health and air and give Echo temporary invulnerability. And since Echo is a mammal, he must periodically surface for air, or else find an air vent. If the air meter runs out, Echo loses health rapidly, which represents drowning. Despite the oddness of this game, I think it's actually very well done, and it also frequently tops a lot of top Sega Genesis games of all time lists. And although this is another one of Sega's franchises that did not survive past the Genesis, it has been ported to a lot of modern consoles, helping to ensure this is one of Sega's more remembered franchises. ToeJam Earl was released for the Sega Genesis in 1991. It centers on ToeJam and Earl, who are alien rappers that have crash-landed on Earth. As they attempt to escape the planet, players must assume the role of either character and collect pieces of their wrecked spacecraft. This game's design was heavily influenced by the role-playing video game Rogue, and it took such features such as the random generation of levels and items. It references and parodies 1980s and early 90s urban culture, and is set to a funk soundtrack. Despite being positively received by critics, who praised its originality, soundtrack, humor, and two-player co-op mode, it was not an initial sales success. However, it did attain sleeper hit status as it became more successful the longer it was on the market, and its protagonists were used as mascots by Sega. My initial impression of this game is that it's actually not that bad of a game, but there's not really too much that sticks out to it other than its theme. In fact, I think some of the reviewers at the time nailed down why this game became so popular, with one saying that it was an okay game, but one which becomes completely essential when played with someone else. If you're looking for not the usual fare of platformer, this is a game that would be for you, although I do admit it will not be for everyone. Ristar is a platform game developed and published by Sega that was released worldwide in February of 1995. This game stars an anthropomorphic cartoon star who uses his hands and long stretchable arms to move and combat enemies. While this game plays very similar to games such as Super Mario and Sonic the Hedgehog, this game is a bit of a departure by focusing less on jumping and speed and more on the use of Ristar's stretchable arms, which can reach and stretch in 8 different directions. However, the game is very similar in the fact that the player must maneuver Ristar through the level to its end while avoiding damage from obstacles and enemies. A couple things that I personally like about this game is the fact that it was one of the later games produced for the Sega Genesis, which was during the time that most programmers had got the hardware down and were using and exploiting a lot of hardware trickery to push the console to its maximum limits, which I think makes the game look overall a lot better than some of the previous games on this system. Ristar controls very well, and everything kinda has a natural flow to it. I would say if you're definitely a fan of those platformers similar to Sonic the Hedgehog or Mario, this is a game that you should try because of its unique differences and take on the genre. Rocket Knight Adventures was developed and published by Konami for the Sega Genesis in 1993. In this game, the player is able to jump and attack with Sparkster's sword, either directly or by shooting energy forward when swung, or charge up their rocket pack to go flying in one of 8 directions. The gameplay is varied up across a few levels. For example, some levels are horizontal scrolling shooters, similar in gameplay to Gradius, while another level has the player controlling a large machine to duel with Axle Gear. Overall, though, this game was received very well upon release, with several reviewers calling it one of the best games on the system, as well as one of the greatest platformers ever made. I never actually played this game before collecting it in preparation for this review, and I was pleasantly surprised by how well it performs. Overall, I would also include this as a game worthy of note for the Sega Genesis, and although they did make a sequel for this game called Sparkster, it is actually a little bit more rare and hence more expensive to collect for the platform, resulting in me not being able to play it for this review. So again, that is just a few of the iconic platforming titles that are available on this system. And there are a few of them that even I had in the montage that I didn't really cover or mention, and that's just because we're running out of time. But to sum up, I am going to call a few of them to attention, such as Streets of Rage, because that is just an iconic series that really flourished on the Genesis. It was one of the most popular beat-em-up style of games on there, and even though it's not necessarily platforming, it is more of the action genre. That iconic soundtrack and gameplay that was very prevalent in the early 1990s is best exemplified in Streets of Rage 2, and I think that probably remains my favorite of that series. Comix Zone is another example of a game that I think is a good action game on the system, but I think it's good because of its uniqueness. The fact that they decided to kind of have the player play through a comic book on this system really just shows how they were pushing it to its limit back in 1995. To date, I don't think I've seen a game that really lets you play through a comic book quite like this, and I think I would like to see a more modern system try to do this again today, and I think I would enjoy it a lot. Michael Jackson's Moonwalker is another one of those games that I think has to be mentioned, just because it was one of the first kind of hit platformers for the system, and I think that was mainly due to the fact that Sega licensed the rights for Michael Jackson and his music for that game to help kind of sell it and get the system bolstered up a little bit. But more than just this game itself, I think this game kind of exemplifies one of the most successful strategies that Sega used with the Genesis, and that is licensing things that are popular. I mean, in the late 80s, early 90s, Michael Jackson was at the peak of his popularity, and of course, aside from the scandals that would hit him in his later life, this was probably one of the most iconic things that could have happened on a video game console at that time. I did have The Adventures of Batman and Robin in that list as well, and I didn't really want to include it as one of the better games on the system. I really just wanted to talk about what a technological achievement it is on this system. The graphics of this game are some of the best that I have seen all throughout the game. It's not just necessarily that they had one stage that had a neat effect, or it had an overall good visual appeal. I mean, each stage does something that I don't think I see very often on these 2D systems of the 16-bit era. But putting all the graphics aside, I think the gameplay is not up to snuff in certain parts. I found some of the game incredibly frustrating, and I didn't really care for certain parts of it, but overall I think that it's a solid B title at least. Again, kind of glazing over it, but I just wanted to mention it here because it is a title I think should not be overlooked for the fact that it was able to do a lot of things with the Genesis that I didn't really see often in too many other games. And the last game I'm going to mention is one of my favorite franchises from video game history around this time period, and that is Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles: The Hyperstone Heist. This game doesn't really break the mold in terms of what a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle game should be. It's just that style of game on the Sega Genesis. I think this game is possibly one of my favorite on the system, even though I haven't owned it for that long. But after everything that I've said about all the platform games on this system, I have to ask, what did I miss? I'm sure there are iconic games out there that you guys have played that I'd either skipped or completely glazed over that really deserve their due recognition. Please leave a comment down below. I'd really like to see what your guys' thoughts are on this, and if I'm compelled to, maybe in a future video, I'll dedicate more time to those games. Also keep in mind that this list is kind of exclusive to what games I have collected for the system. I do have a lot of Sega Genesis games that I have collected, but I haven't collected them all. And if it's rare or particularly expensive, I can't really feature it in this video because I don't own them. But anyway, that about wraps it up for this video. In the next video, we're going to talk about the shooting games. And even though it's not everyone's cup of tea, I'd really like to ask your guys' input. What games do you think should be included in the Ultimate Sega Genesis review that would fit the genre of a shooter game? Again, go ahead and leave your suggestions in the comments below. As always, I do want to thank you all so much for watching. Remember, if you like what you see, please hit that like and subscribe button. It really helps me out and supports this channel. I really look forward to bringing you guys the next video in this series, so stay tuned, and I'll see you next time. If you like this video and you'd like to help out with future projects on this channel, please consider supporting me on Patreon. Again, I want to thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you next time.